Oh my God.
Gotta move back. You with me, John?
The terrorist attack of September 11, 2001 is one of the most important events in history, a subject that cannot be forgotten, especially in the United States. Leaving almost 3,000 victims, more than 340 firefighters, 24 policemen and 227 civilians, and a gigantic trauma in American history. For many historians, this was the event that marked the beginning of the 11th century, an event that literally changed the history of the world. That morning, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial passenger planes. These are the 4 flights used in the attack. American Airlines Flight 11. The flight took off from Boston to Los Angeles. It was the first plane to collide with the Twin Towers and reach the North Tower. United Airlines Flight 175. This flight also took off from Boston to Los Angeles. It was the second plane to collide with the Twin Towers and hit the South Tower. American Airlines Flight 77. Flight took off from Washington to Los Angeles. It was launched against the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93. Flight took off from Newark to San Francisco. It would be launched against the Capitol, but it fell before reaching its target. The September 11th attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, which at the time was led by Osama bin Laden, the multi-millionaire Arab and one of the founders of this terrorist organization. The motivations that led bin Laden and Al-Qaeda to carry out attacks against the United States are the result of a long process that began in the 1970s. Taking this context into account, we must understand that the motivation for the attack was the existing enmity of Islamic fundamentalists and the United States. This was motivated by the interventions of the Americans in the nations of the Middle East and by their support for the State of Israel. In the 1970s, the United States faced 2 major challenges in the Middle East: the 1973 oil crisis and the Islamic Revolution that took place in Iran in 1979, which made the value of oil soar in the international market. And the second was a religious and conservative revolution that overthrew the pro-Western government that existed in Iran and installed a Shiite regime. This second event caused the U.S. government to lose the alliance it had with that country, one of its main allies in the region. Events that caused U.S. policy in the Middle East to be changed and become more aggressive. In 1979, Afghanistan, a country with a communist government, was invaded by the Soviet troops who came to the aid of that government. The U.S. saw this as a great opportunity to destabilize its greatest adversary. And since it has been funding dissidents that existed in the interior of Afghanistan and fought against the communist government, the Mujahideen. These rebel forces brought together reactionary groups that began to receive weapons and money from Americans and Saudis, U.S. allies. They wanted these forces to overthrow the Afghan communist government and hit the Soviet economy. Years later, these groups, once armed by the United States and other allies, ended up transforming themselves into Islamic fundamentalist organizations. The Americans' role in financing these counter-revolutionary forces other than Palestinian named Abdullah Azzam, who called for a jihad, holy war, for Muslims, against the Soviets. It was Azzam who invited bin Laden to go to Afghanistan to participate in the fight against the USSR. However, a few years later, Azzam and bin Laden broke up when he decided to turn against the decadent Muslims as well. With that, bin Laden ended up founding Al-Qaeda, which is currently one of the biggest terrorist organizations in the world. Until then, bin Laden had counted on the support of the United States in the fight against the communists. However, the Gulf War ended up souring the relationship that existed between the two countries. In 1990, the Iraqi army invaded Kuwait and forced the Kuwaiti royal family to take refuge in the Saudi capital, which created a climate of tension between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, an Arab, offered his services to defend Saudi territory. Bin Laden wanted the Saudi monarchy to hire him with his mujahideen to defend the territory, but the Saudis turned down bin Laden's offer and opted to let American troops ensure security. The rejection of his proposal by his infuriated bin Laden, arguing that the presence of foreigners protecting Saudi Arabia's sacred soil was sacrilege. After criticizing the Saudi government, bin Laden was banned from the country and exiled to Sudan. In this episode, bin Laden's enmity with the Americans was born. Bin Laden's hatred of the United States ended up being heightened by other issues, such as their support for the State of Israel, his role in signing a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine in the 1990s, and his intervention in other Islamic countries. In the same period, bin Laden started to defend the idea of carrying out an attack against the U.S. The attacks began with the hijacking of 4 commercial planes, 2 Boeing 757 and 2 Boeing 767, which took off from the east coast of the United States towards California. Terrorists hijacked the flights: American Airlines Flight 11, Flight 77 and Flight 175, and United Airlines Flight 93. These took off from the cities of Boston, Washington and Newark, heading for Los Angeles and San Francisco. Of the 4 flights mentioned, 3 managed to hit their targets, but the 4th, as we'll see, crashed before hitting its target. On that day, the 19 terrorists boarded, and when the aircraft were already in the air, they surrendered the crew and passengers, and then readjusted the aircraft routes to their targets. It all started with American Airlines Flight 11, which took off at 7:59 a.m. from Boston and headed for Los Angeles. Less than an hour later, at precisely 8:46 a.m., the plane was launched against the North Tower or World Trade Center, one of the World Trade Center, a commercial complex located in the heart of the island of Manhattan. Less than 20 minutes later, the second plane, American Airlines Flight 175, was launched, this time, against the South Tower or World Trade Center 2, colliding with the second tower at exactly 9:03 a.m.
But either way, extensive damage was done.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing?
At that time, the international press was already covering it, and the attack on the second tower was broadcast live across the planet.
Oh my God.
The third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, was launched against the Pentagon, the building that houses the U.S. Department of Defense, at 9:37 a.m. And the fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed at 10:03 a.m. in the interior of the state of Pennsylvania. At the time, it was speculated that this plan would be launched against the White House, but evidence suggested that its target was possibly the Capitol. The fourth plane missed its target because its passengers were told it was an attack, and then they rebelled against the terrorists, who ended up shooting down the plane earlier than expected. In all, the September 11th attacks caused the deaths of 2,996 people, including 19 terrorists. Among the death toll, 2,606 people died in New York, 246 in planes and 125 in the Pentagon, as mentioned. The remaining 19 were terrorists.